Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. The ongoing Chilcot Iraq inquiry in Britain has listened to dozens of key witnesses, including former Prime Minister Tony Blair. It is highly unlikely that it will discover a smoking gun. The stunning revelation, however, by the independent newspaper that Blair's government drew up plans to oust Saddam Hussein before 9/11 contradicts Blair's testimony to the panel. The inquiry and the stunning revelation cast Blair and former President Bush as violators of international law. But the bigger question is, where do the families of innocent dead Iraqis go for justice? Will they be forgotten? Or will Bush and Blair be tried for crimes against humanity?
Today, the Iraq inquiry will be hearing from the Right Honourable Tony Blair.
Britain's Iraq War inquiry, headed by Lord Chilcot, officially began last summer, but it's only now that the key figures in the run-up to the Iraq War are being heard. The most prominent of all, former Prime Minister Tony Blair. With 179 British casualties and an estimated 1 million Iraqis killed since 2003, the families of the victims may have been hoping for signs of regret, but their hopes were disappointed.
No regrets.
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein. I think he was...
Be quiet, please.
I think that he was a monster. I believe he threatened not just the region, but the world. And in the circumstances that we faced then, but I think even if you look back now, it was better to deal with this threat, to deal with it, to remove him from office. And I do genuinely believe that the world is safer as a result.
Harsh criticism came from Claire Short, the former Secretary of State for International Development. She said the government deliberately misled its cabinet and its people.
There was never a meeting that said, what's the problem, what are we trying to achieve, what are our military, diplomatic options. We never had that coherent discussion of what it is that the problem was and what it was that the government was trying to achieve and what our bottom lines were. Never. Tony Blair's account of the need to act urgently somehow because of September the 11th, I think doesn't stack up to any scrutiny whatsoever. We've made Iraq more dangerous as well as causing enormous suffering.
In the coming months, Gordon Brown will be heard, as well as more senior diplomats and military commanders. It is the most comprehensive inquiry into the Iraq War so far, but it has no legal status. Critics say no matter how compelling the evidence, no one will be held accountable for what happened in Iraq. Stephanie Dutzer for Inside Iraq.
To discuss the Chilcot Iraq inquiry and the bigger question of who is responsible and whether the war was legal or not, I'm joined from Washington by David Pollack, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and from London by Lindsay German, the convener of the British anti-war organization Stop the War Coalition, and by Benga Odantan, a professor of law at the University of Kent in Great Britain. Welcome to Inside Iraq. David Pollack, let me start with you and let us go to the very heart of the matter. And really, once I ask the question, I don't know which way this episode is going to go for. This war was deemed illegal by Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General. Recently, the Dutch government issued a report that says this war was illegal. Let us start by that premise and we go forward. Do you agree with that indictment?
No, I disagree totally with that idea. It's a fantasy. The United Nations Charter explicitly reserves the right for individual and collective self-defense to every member of the United Nations. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, was the same man who said famously that he, quote, could do business, unquote, with Saddam Hussein, a murderous, aggressive dictator, if ever there was one. And so his views about the legality of the Iraq War are totally irrelevant. Likewise, whatever citation you're offering from the Dutch, it was not, in my view, in question at any time the legality of the war. Its wisdom and the way in which the war was conducted, those are legitimate questions for inquiry. And I think the Chilcot inquiry is a tribute to the government and to the people of Great Britain in the way in which they are conducting a balanced and fair investigation of this episode. I wish that Arab governments would do likewise. And in fact, when so many Arab governments quietly and privately supported the war against Saddam Hussein, it seems to me quite hypocritical, even ridiculous, for the Arab media, including, I'm sorry to say, Al Jazeera, to be talking in such a loaded and tendentious fashion about that war.
Let us bring, in that case, a professor of law, Dontan. When you hear such dismissal, such a blanket dismissal by David Pollock and many others, not to mention Tony Blair in his testimony to the Chilcot inquiry, that this war is justified on several grounds, and not to mention the law. Now, when you dismiss Kofi Annan as the top legal mind or top representative of international security, and then you say this war is legal, where do we go from here when it comes to international law then?
Well, I think we have to return to international law itself, something which seems to have been in the background for most of the commentary in relation to this politics-led war against Iraq. International law is quite clear on the issue of use of force. I've listened carefully to what my friend Pollock has said, and he has not said anything different from what any apologist of the war would say. So therefore, the first thing to do is to consider the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations, which is the ground norm for the use of force, indeed the organization of the international community since 1945, is quite clear, philosophically, textually, and in all possible ways, that the use of force is forbidden in international relations. I will start with Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter, which requests that members of the United Nations, member states of the United Nations, should refrain from the use of force, the threat of the use of force, and acts against the independence and territorial integrity of member states. And I think no other state has provided us a good example of what happens when you do this than Iraq itself. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, yes, early in the 90s, Article 2, Paragraph 4 showed clearly that Iraq had done something wrong. And the consequences of that were several United Nations resolutions.
That brings me to,
for example,
to the point to bring Lindsey German. In your coalition of Stop the War, you must have been disheartened by listening to Tony Blair, even before his testimony to the inquiry, saying exactly the following: even if I knew then what I know now, and that is Iraq does not have WMDs, I would still go for the war. When you have such attitude, when you have such cavalier attitudes towards war, in which more than 1 million Iraqi died, what do you think?
Well, I think that many people were quite disgusted by Blair's evidence. After all, there was a poll done just 2 days later by the Mail on Sunday, which showed that 80% of people in Britain thought he was lying at the Chilcot inquiry, and more than a third of them think he should be tried as a war criminal. And I would take issue with your guest from Washington, because when he says that there's nothing illegal about it, the truth is that Britain wasn't under threat from Saddam Hussein, nor was the United States. Blair repeatedly in his evidence tried to link the war on Iraq with 9/11. There is absolutely no evidence of any link between Iraq and 9/11. And of course, Blair showed that not only is he not sorry about the Iraq war, but he wants future wars, because he mentioned Iran 58 times in his
Let me stop you for just a second, Lindsey German, because since you mentioned 9/11, it has been revealed by the independent newspaper that Blair's government, ministers, they were drawing plans to out Saddam. This is 5 months before 9/11. This is sometimes in April and May of 2001.
Well, we know that the Bush administration was keen to attack Iraq from day one of its administration. So as you quite rightly say, there were talks there was talk in the administration that they wanted to do so, and now it appears that Blair himself was complicit in this. He denied that he did a deal with Bush in 2002, but frankly, that is simply not credible when you look at much of the evidence around his visit to the Crawford Ranch. So I think people are very, very, they're not surprised, but they are quite appalled at Blair's evidence, and I think that's why people like Claire Short got a much better response, because people felt that she was much closer to telling the truth.
Before I give a chance to David Pollack to answer, let me put something up on the screen. It is Article 12 of Resolution 1441. Let me just read it to you, David Pollack. It gives you an idea where the collective thinking of the Security Council was. Here it goes. The Security Council decides to convene immediately upon receipt of a report in accordance with paragraphs 4 or 11. 4 and 11, they are related to reports by Onmovic and by Blix above, in order to consider the situation and the need for full compliance with all of the relevant council resolutions in order to secure international peace and security. Basically, what the council is saying, David Pollack, that now we have warned Iraq, but nobody should do anything. We just have to wait for reports from Blix and Baradi, and then we take it further. There was no authorization for a second resolution.
There was no need for a second resolution, and frankly, all of this talk about legality and Security Council resolutions is quite beside the point. As I said, if Saudi Arabia, for example,
we cannot discuss.
Excuse me.
On this matter without looking at the law. You cannot just dismiss the law in your first and opening statement on this issue. It's impossible.
The law.
This is
I am not.
action.
It is you. I'm sorry, sir. It is you, sir, who are dismissing the law. The United Nations Charter, to which you referred, reserves explicitly the right to every country, individually and collectively, to make sovereign decisions about war and peace, and to act, if necessary, with force in self-defense. So if Saudi Arabia, for example, defends itself...
With due respect to you, I disagree.
You may disagree,
and
then we disagree. But what I am trying to say...
The Article 12 I just put on the screen is talking in the collective. It says we have to come back and convene again and then decide. It did not allow, it did not give any green light to an individual country.
That is absolutely false. That is not what the United Nations Charter says. That is not what the Security Council said. And if Saudi Arabia today, for example, goes to war in order to defend itself against an invasion by tribes from Yemen, the Houthis, it doesn't need the Security Council to guarantee itself that legal right. And if NATO, including the United States and Britain and other countries, go to war to defend the Muslims in Kosovo, as they did in the 1990s, it didn't need the Security Council to defend that legal right. That legal right is enshrined in the United Nations Charter.
If you are referring to the right of self-defense, the right of self-defense is not open-ended. It is based on the requirement of imminence of the threat. It's also based clearly on proportionality.
I'm sorry, that is not the case, sir. The right of self-defense is a sovereign right that every nation reserves to itself,
Britain and America
explicitly guaranteed by the United Nations Charter.
That is the crucial question here.
You are referring to
that is not the crucial question. I am sorry,
it wasn't
madam.
a war of defense, it was a war of aggression.
I am sorry,
Clearly
but that is not true.
The
Security Council, that is clearly not the case. The Security Council itself had defined Iraq's behavior as a threat to international peace and security.
It's why every single lawyer who was employed by the Foreign Office in Britain believed that this war was unlawful. This came out at the Chilcot inquiry last week as well. This was the overwhelming weight of legal opinion internationally, was that there was no case to go to war.
Madam, lawyers disagree with each other. That's why there are lawyers. Some lawyers argue one side of the case.
And that's why there is United Nations, David Pollack.
Argue the other side. And the United Nations, the Security Council itself, decreed that Iraq's behavior under this murderous dictator, Saddam Hussein, was a threat to international peace and security. and that all necessary
go back to
measures
Article
under
1441?
Chapter 7 were legal in that case. And there is no reason actually today to discuss this or debate it any further.
Let us move on, David Pollack. Let's.
No,
Excuse me, Jason. Make it a quick.
Can we go back to 1441? 1441 does say that there might have been some material breaches by Iraq. 1441 does lay down a future where the issue will be decided based on the finding that there will be serious consequences upon Iraq if it fails to be in accordance with the inspection regime. 1441 did not use a very important phrase, which was the use of all necessary means. That in international diplomacy is the code for resort to the use of force. And the United States of America knew that. UK knew that.
Let David answer that quickly. Make it quick, David.
I believe that, again, no specific resolution is needed to justify legally or morally the right.
But then again, David, you would say that, wouldn't you, if you are representing a government that actually went to war without a second resolution? But let me go to Lindsey German.
Jassim, I am not representing any government.
At the time you were part of the government anyway. But Lindsey German, when we recall certain cases, for instance, Milosevic, or even right now Omar al-Bashir, perhaps he will be hauled all the way to The Hague and be indicted and tried. Is there any ground, although perhaps it's far-fetched, I know that, I'm the first one to recognize that it will be tremendously difficult to try Blair and Bush?
Many people in Britain are trying to get a case to take Blair and presumably Bush to the Hague, or to have them indicted. They're finding it very, very difficult for the reasons that you say. It seems to me that, as has been demonstrated in this discussion, the biggest countries, the biggest countries in the world are actually the countries that decide international law, and it's usually the rulers of the middle-sized countries, the ones that are defeated, that suffer the going to court, as was the case with Milosevic and indeed with Saddam Hussein, who of course was hanged. I don't see any prospect realistically that Tony Blair will be taken to court, and I think this is a terrible miscarriage of justice, because, as you said earlier, 1 million Iraqis have died. This has been an absolutely terrible situation for the people of Iraq, and I personally feel it's rather sickening when I hear not just Blair but Jack Straw and these other people say how sorry they were. Jack Straw had doubts about the war. They were prepared to prosecute this war regardless, and we have seen the terrible consequences in the 7 years since then.
Oh, indeed, it is a terrible consequences, David Pollack, when you consider the tremendous number of Iraqis, needless to say also British soldiers and American soldiers. Deep in your heart, do you see those people being done a bad deal? They were just innocent people?
Many innocent people, tragically, and deep in my heart, I grieve for them because I knew many of them. They were friends of mine. I've spent time in Iraq myself. They have been killed in the Iraq wars. But many, many, many more Iraqis were killed by Saddam Hussein, and would have continued to be killed by Saddam Hussein. And many Arabs in neighboring countries and many Iranians were killed by Saddam Hussein and his armies. The figure of 1 million Iraqis killed is a lie. And most of the Iraqis
I then wonder how you got your figures of the people killed by Saddam. I wonder how you got your figures about the people killed by Saddam.
Most of the Iraqis,
where did you get those figures from?
I get my figures from IraqCasualties.org, an independent scientific institution. And most of those Iraqis were killed by other Iraqis, or by other Arabs, or by Iranians, not by Americans or British soldiers.
But here is the question, David.
They were killed
I feel sorry for them, Jassim.
Here is the question, David. Here is the question.
And I feel sorry for those of you who have no grief and no words
Here is the
for
question,
the millions
David.
of victims
Would those
of Saddam
people have
Hussein.
died if there was no invasion in 2003? Would over 1 million people have died?
It is not over
not.
1 million people, Jassim.
Are
You
we
are
quibbling?
repeating
Are
a
we quibbling
propaganda
over
number.
500,000 or a quarter of a
We are
million or
not-
100,000?
How many numbers? How many
Jassim,
people will be okay for David, please? How many people will be okay
this-
for David to
this is-
justify this war in terms of people who have
Not
died?
one
How many
person
will be okay
is
for you?
okay. Not a single person is okay. But to justify the
I'm very
war,
happy to hear
I
that,
will
actually.
tell you that Saddam Hussein killed millions of people. And if
He
thousands
killed the people
have been
in
killed
Iran
by-
when your government backed him, when the Americans backed Saddam Hussein
We did not-
against
we
the
did not
Iranians. That
back
is a
him,
simple fact. So
and
don't
that
turn
is
around now
completely-
and say
and-
that he killed
that
lots
is
of people. You
completely
armed him and
irrelevant.
you supported him for years. It is not
We did not
irrelevant.
arm him.
irrelevant.
We
It is
did
not
not
irrelevant.
support him.
You
It's
are
not
trying,
irrelevant.
And that
you
is
are trying to
completely
justify
irrelevant.
an unjustifiable illegal war. That is the truth, and you
That
should be
is-
ashamed of yourself. You're the people who took us into this war, and you won't even have the decency now
That-
to admit you were wrong. That was a shameful
So
thing
you
about
would-
Blair on Friday, and you're
So
repeating
you
his
would
lies.
prefer to have Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq today, would you? That's what is
I would
shameful.
prefer
I
the
submit to
Iraqis
you.
not to have been invaded and not to have been occupied. I had no time for Saddam
In other words,
Hussein,
for
but I
Saddam
have absolutely
Hussein-
no time for the Americans and the
For
British
Saddam
who
Hussein-
waged war against him.
For Saddam Hussein to still be in power
let us listen
today.
to Benga.
Or perhaps
Go ahead, Benga.
Perhaps Uday
The
or
end does
Qusay
not
would have been
justify the
better
means.
for Iraq and for the region.
David,
Is that
give a
your
chance
argument?
to Odantan. Let's hear from Odantan. Go ahead.
Please.
Yes, I would just like to say to my friend David that the end certainly does not justify the means. If I may quote Mr. Davies himself, in a recent publication of his on Arab public opinion, he was quite
Yes.
clear upon the fact that almost all Arab polls show widespread disapproval for American invasion of Iraq, and that the support for American invasion of Iraq, or indeed any form of occupation of Iraq, is lower now than it was even in 1990 when the invasion of Kuwait took place.
Give him a chance to
How do you
answer, and that
justify
will be
such
the
a
closer of
statement
the
with
show.
what you're
Go ahead,
saying now?
David. What do you make of that quotation?
Well, first, I really appreciate your
He did the
willingness
research on you,
and
yes.
desire to read my remarks. Second, what Arab public opinion thinks about various issues is not, in my mind, a judge of its morality. It's a judge of its popularity. And those are
Is
two
it a judge of his
completely different questions.
legality? Is it a judge of his legality?
I'm going to ask the two gentlemen to give the last word to Lindsay German. Close the show for me, Lindsay.
Well, I just think this shows the continued hypocrisy of the people who took us into war. He says he's not interested in Arab public opinion. He's not interested in the people who believe that getting rid of Saddam Hussein was worse than what they're now suffering. He's not interested in anything apart from his own
I'm the one
narrow
who,
views. He's in the
I'm
Tony
the
Blair
one
camp,
who is
and these
interested
people are
in
a
it.
tiny minority
It is
of
you
warmongers around the
who
world.
is not interested.
Lindsay German, David Pollack, Benga Odantan, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To watch the show online, please visit our website, aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, this is Jassim Azawi wishing you a great week.